All right, so let's go ahead and begin. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this International Programs webinar titled Sustainability and Innovation at the Genesee Generating Station and Supporting CCUS Deployments. My name is McDonald, and I'm a manager with the International Programs at EEI, and we're excited to host this webinar with one of our members, Capital Power. In this webinar, they will highlight their sustainability strategy and investment in and support for development and deployment of CCUS technologies. But before I introduce our presenters today, I'm going to just very quickly cover some housekeeping items. So firstly, questions can be submitted using the chat feature. And the chat feature, if you don't see it on the right-hand side of your screen, can be located by clicking a text message looking button at the bottom of your screen. And so at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for a moderated Q&A, so please don't forget to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Importantly, as well, this webinar is being recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be made available on our EEI International Programs YouTube channel, and a copy of the presentation slides and the recording link will be shared within about a week of today. So without further ado, I am very excited to introduce our panelists today, Lori Nickifor, who is VP for Engineering with Capital Power, and Daniel Jurijew, who is Vice President of Government and External Relations for Capital Power. So in her role as VP for Engineering for Capital Power, Lori has over 22 years of experience in the energy and power industries and is currently responsible for a 70-person team of professional engineers and designers whose functions include support for the development and construction of sustaining capital projects and day-to-day operational and reliability engineering support for Capital Power's fleet. Daniel Jurijew is currently Vice President for Government and External Relations for Capital Power. Prior to his appointment to this role in August 2017, Daniel served for 3 years as Vice President of Regulatory and Environmental Policy. Daniel has been with Capital Power since its inception in 2009 and has over 18 years of experience in electricity markets. Daniel is accountable and responsible for Capital Power's government relations and stakeholder engagement activities and all of Capital Power's internal and external communications in all of the Canadian and U.S. jurisdictions in which Capital Power has assets in operation or development. And so we're very, very happy to have these esteemed speakers with us today to share their company strategy and what's happening in CCUS investments. And so Daniel and Lori, I will pass it off to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. On behalf of Capital Power, we appreciate the opportunity to participate in the webinar and provide an overview of Capital Power, some of the exciting initiatives underway at our Genesee station, and other longer-term initiatives underway as part of our ongoing sustainability efforts. We don't, sorry, Jessica, just noticed we don't have the deck up on our screen.
It should be up now. Do you see it?
Fortunately, no. We have the webinar housekeeping slide up.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So
okay.
We're good.
Great.
Yep. So I'll first provide a brief overview of Capital Power, touching on our current geographic footprint and fleet profile, our broad strategic focus. I'll then briefly describe some of the key market and policy features of Alberta's wholesale electricity market. The competitive dynamics of Alberta's market framework have provided an ongoing imperative for efficiency and innovation across our fleet, which is driving a lot of the initiatives that Lori will talk about. Lori will then review our Genesee Generating Station and some of the more specific initiatives underway at the site to evolve its operations while maintaining and enhancing its competitive position. We'll then close with an overview of our recent initiatives relating to carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which we believe is a critical technology as part of the toolkit for governments and markets to achieve long-term climate objectives. With respect to our footprint, and we are Capital Power is a wholesale power generator based in Edmonton, Alberta, and we're publicly traded on the TSX. Our current generation portfolio includes 26 facilities totaling nearly 6,000 megawatts. This includes assets in 3 provinces, Alberta, Ontario, and BC, and 6 states. Our fleet reflects a diverse range of fuel types, including natural gas peaking, cogeneration facilities, and combined cycle units, renewable facilities, primarily wind, and solar facilities in the U.S., coal, which we'll get into more detail here shortly, and waste heat and solid fuels. On a capacity basis, our fleet is roughly 55% natural gas, 15% wind, and 27% coal. Of our fleet, 9 of the facilities are in Alberta, including all 4 of the coal facilities, which we'll get into more detail on. Of the 4, 3 are at our Genesee Generating Station, and the 4th reflects 50% interest in Keep Hills 3, which is a supercritical unit co-owned with TransAlta and TransAlta sites. We've recently announced an agreement with TransAlta where we would swap our respective interests in Keep Hills 3 and the Genesee 3 unit. So subject to the close of that transaction, we will only have the 3 coal facilities at Genesee in our fleet. And that will just some context for Lori's discussion of the Genesee station. As the slide also notes, we're also an active participant in carbon markets across North America. We've developed expertise in this field initially following the introduction of large emitter carbon pricing in Alberta in 2007. But building off of that expertise, we are now an active participant in Alberta's market, as well as in the WCI carbon market, as well as the REGI markets out east in the U.S. This chart highlights the 3 key focus areas for our strategy, both in the near term and over the long term. With respect to the first row, continued investment in renewables is a key pillar. In addition to the facilities we currently operate, we have 2 wind facilities now under construction, 1 in Alberta, 1 in Illinois. And upon completion of those, that will bring our installed wind capacity to over 1,100 megawatts. And looking forward, we are pursuing more opportunities in the solar space in the U.S. and as part of that also giving consideration to solar and battery technology and how those technologies complement one another. The second area of focus is continued investment in natural gas. A large part of our recent growth has been an acquisition and development of efficient natural gas facilities in Alberta, Ontario, and in the U.S. We continue to believe natural gas has a long-term role in markets with increasing penetration of renewable energy, providing critical firming and backstop services over long term. And in addition to that, it pairs in with our third commitment of exploring carbon capture, utilization, and storage and carbon recovery technologies to help natural gas generation become a zero or near zero emitting fuel as part of a decarbonized grid. And the third pillar is transitioning our heritage coal generation. These are specifically the Genesee units. They are currently already the best and most efficient units in Alberta with respect to coal generation, and through the initiatives Lori will talk about, our commitment is to ensure the efficiency benefits of those units remain as they're transitioned off of coal into natural gas service beyond 2030. This slide's taken from our recent investor deck and provides a snapshot of the evolution and growth in our earnings since 2014 and our expectations over the next five years, and shows them both with respect to the geographical split on top and the fuel mix split on the bottom row. As the top 3 charts show, from a geographic perspective, we've significantly increased our operations outside of our home province of Alberta to the point where roughly half of our earnings are from facilities outside of the province. Going forward, we'll continue to pursue opportunities in Alberta, across Canada, and in the U.S., but the chart does show a continued increase in our ex-Alberta earnings, just given where we currently project the opportunities to arise. The bottom chart reflects our earnings profile on a fuel basis. And from these charts, it highlights the growth we've seen in natural gas and wind development in our new markets as we've grown. In 2014, nearly 2/3 of our earnings were from our coal generation facilities, and 1/3 was from gas and renewables. Contrast that with where we are today, with roughly 2/3 of our earnings coming from natural gas and renewables. Note that in the charts for 2019 and 2024, there is a new category that we've labeled as dual fuel. This reflects the capability we currently have and will be expanding at our coal facilities at Genesee to utilize natural gas as fuel. And Lori will get, again, some of the details around the 100% capability we'll be establishing. Since our inception in 2009, there has been a commitment to sustainability and efficiency across our operations, and as part of our reporting, we have issued annual corporate sustainability reports that summarize and report on these initiatives. In our most recent corporate sustainability report that was issued earlier this year, we did provide our first specific sustainability targets, identifying specific longer-term objectives we're striving for, and those are listed on the slide. With respect to new natural gas facilities, there's a commitment that those will be constructed to be carbon capture and or hydrogen ready. Specifically with respect to Genesee, a metric of reducing our actual CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. Fleet-wide, the third bullet commits us to reducing our actual CO2 emissions by 10% and emission intensity by 65% relative to 2005 levels. And as noted in that bullet, those goals are against a growth trajectory that does see us growing our fleet by 145%. And then lastly, and enabling the second and third bullet, is continuing to invest in CCUS technology to eventually decarbonize the gas fleet. So the last slide before turning it over to Lori, just to provide some context for the drivers around Genesee. Just to provide a brief overview of Alberta's market. So Alberta's market design, for those who are unfamiliar, it's an energy-only market, and it's a wholesale market design that's been in place since 2001 and was recently reaffirmed by the new government. Key features of this market is that it's an hourly spot market for electricity, where the pool price is established through on an hourly basis through a merit order, and the merit order in turn reflects competitive offers by all generating units in the fleet, and it's only units that get dispatched in the hour receive the pool price. It's not a capacity market, and it's unlike a capacity market that there's not a separate revenue stream for just being available. You only get paid when you run. And it's also different than a regulated market where there's no guaranteed return on investment or guarantee of cost recovery. It's a merchant wholesale market that provides an ongoing imperative for and rewards the most efficient units. So that's the first element to note. And then, as the slide highlights, Capital Power has been the largest single investor in new capacity since 2001. And our current fleet represents roughly 15% of the installed capacity in Alberta. A second feature of the market, and as I've touched on, is Alberta has had large emitter carbon pricing in place since 2007. The framework that existed from 2007 to 2017 established the compliance obligation for each unit relative to its own baseline, and that baseline was initially 12%, then increased to about 20%. And that baseline multiplied by the carbon price set the carbon obligation. In 2018, there was a significant change to the carbon pricing framework where every unit was assessed relative to the emission intensity of a best gas unit, which was a combined cycle unit. So the effect was significant for coal units in particular, and on an average basis, the carbon-related variable costs went from roughly $6 a megawatt hour to about $18 a megawatt hour in 2018 under the current framework. And the new government has undertaken a review of the carbon pricing framework, but the expectation is it will retain the obligation based on a best gas standard, at least for the electricity sector. So that, again, provided a significant challenge for coal units, which we've addressed through things Lori will talk about. And the other related piece of Alberta's market framework relevant to our Genesee units was the decision by the previous government to introduce a 2030 coal phase out. And that the way it was established, precluded emissions from coal generation beyond 2030. So following discussions with the government, there was an off-coal agreement that we and other affected coal operators entered into that did provide compensation for that. But for Capital Power and our units, the prohibition on coal-related emissions post-2030 relative to the expected operating life that the units had before, it effectively reduced the coal-based operating life by 57% on average. Following Alberta's announcement of a coal phase-out, the federal government did establish standards whereby, depending on the emissions intensity that converted coal units running on gas could achieve, they could operate for up to 10 years beyond their 2030 date. And our current expectation is that under the different standards, we would expect our subcritical units to run for roughly an extra 8 years and the supercriticals for up to 10. So before turning it over to Lori, the things I've just noted as far as Alberta Dynamics have and will continue to provide a strong signal for efficiency optimization and innovation at our fleet. So I'll turn it over to Lori now.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. So I'll start by providing a brief overview of the Genesee Generating Station. So I'll call it Genesee 1, 2, and 3, or G1, 2, and 3 as we move through the slides. But first off, Genesee Generating Station consists of 3 coal-fired units for an approximate total gross value of 1,376 megawatts. Unit 2 was first commissioned in 1989, followed by Unit 1, which was brought online about 5 years later in 1994. And finally, Unit 3, our newest unit, supercritical technology, was commissioned in 2005. As Daniel had mentioned, the original end of design life is a lot longer than we're currently expecting, but the original design life is 2044, 2030 for Unit 1 and 2, and Unit 3 end of design life is 2055. However, with the expected coal phase-out in 2030, we expect only approximately 8 to 10 years post-coal phase-out for 1 and 2 and 3 respectively. You can see we've achieved quite a high availability factor across all 3 units, which is pretty important for baseload generation. We've ranged between 90 to 99%. It's important to note that Unit 2 and 3 were both outage years, planned outage years, so there's a little bit of a lower availability for those 2 units. But again, higher non-outage years, we're seeing closer to the 97, 98, 99% range. Boiler efficiencies at a maximum continuous rating are 87.3% for subcritical technology. It's Unit 1 and 2, and higher for the supercritical technology, about 89.3% for Unit 3. You can see it's a fairly large site covering approximately 500 acres, not including mine or mine operations. And we employ over 300 employees, contractors for the Genesee Station and mine operations. Just lastly, I'd like to mention that we do have permits and regulatory approvals in place for Genesee Unit 4 and 5 expansion. That's 2 one-on-one single shaft power islands of approximately 530 megawatts each, or nominal 1,060 megawatts total. At Capital Power, we understand that innovation is essential to build the energy systems of the future that is required of us, and our mandate is to build sustainable, competitive, and future-ready power. This requires not just technological change, but changes in people and process as well. So over the next few slides, I will highlight 3 of our innovative initiatives we have underway on this front, and Daniel will kick off the 3rd one as we get later on to the slides later on. The first is our Genesee Performance Standard, or GPS initiative, which will set new standards for environmental performance and efficiency at coal-fired generation. The program is now underway at our 3 coal-fired generating units in Alberta, Genesee 1, 2, and 3. These are, as Daniel mentioned, are already the most efficient and best-in-class units in Alberta and North America. However, GPS will improve the GHG emission intensity, performance, and efficiency of the units by approximately 10% by 2021. It will bend the curve of performance and bring the performance of Genesee Units 1 and 2, which are subcritical technology, to near or better than current supercritical technology performance levels, while G3's performance will set new standards for supercritical technology. GPS will result in a significant carbon cost savings for us in Alberta's carbon pricing framework and lower plant emissions by roughly 1 million tons. The initiative has a relatively small capital component relating to the installation of high-efficiency rotors and a total capital cost of roughly $35 million. The more significant and innovative aspects relate to process efficiencies and optimization and our approach to operating the units. From a technology perspective, there's not just one silver bullet, and I think that the solution is more of a broad, holistic view of how we optimize the entire facility. We've looked at, and you can see sort of the bubbles on the slide that deal with fuel quality, for example. We found that reducing moisture and ash content is an important component of the work we're doing with GPS. Balance of plant performance, reducing the ID fan loading, improving air preheater performance, and reducing the use of auxiliary steam for building heat. So our parasitic or station service load has quite an impact on our performance overall and net power that we're able to put out on the grid. Combustion improvements and intelligent boiler optimization. A few years back, we've installed a feature called Boiler Opt, which consists of combustion optimization tool as well as a soot opt, and that's really to achieve optimal performance in combustion, to improve boiler efficiency, reduce CO2, our NOx emissions, etc., and get a better performance out of our existing boiler. And lastly, a big investment as part of the $35 million is our turbine enhancements. We've upgraded the LP turbine in units 1 and 2. We will be upgrading unit 2 in the next spring outage, but we've installed an upgraded LP rotor this past spring in unit 1, and we're reaping the benefits of those upgrades. And overall, our emission intensity is expected to be reduced by 10% for the entire site from 2016 levels at full load. So Daniel mentioned dual fuel capability at Genesee, and while GPS is one of several initiatives we have underway to conform with Alberta's Climate Leadership Plan provisions and that there will be no emissions from coal generation by 2030, we certainly are moving into something we're calling dual fuel as a second initiative. Dual fuel capability at Genesee, where we plan to optimize the fuel mix between natural gas and coal to maximize our economic returns and also further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, our end goal for dual fuel capability is to enable 100% coal all the way to 100% gas and any fuel combination in between. Total capital cost to transform Genesee Unit 1 and 2 to dual fuel and Genesee 3 to 40% gas capability is approximately $50 million. We currently have the capability to co-fire or on startup up to 20% natural gas, with a plan to increase our capability for Unit 2 in 2020 and Unit 1 in 2021. And finally, we're still looking at the design and timing for Unit 3, but we're looking at optimizing up to 100% for Unit 3. Financial benefits are naturally highly dependent on carbon cost and natural gas price assumptions. However, we do expect solid returns, with AFFO expected or estimated to increase by $10 million in 2020 and $20 million in 2021. We have received approval, or ATCO's received approval for construction of the new high-pressure natural gas pipeline, and construction has already begun at site, with the remaining tie-ins and internal boiler work completed within our regular planned outage in Q2 of 2020. So a little bit of technical information on the modifications required for Unit 1 and 2, which again are subcritical technology. Right now we're looking at a connection to the higher pressure and volume natural gas pipeline at the fence line to our internal boiler piping. We're upgrading internal natural gas piping and vents. We have a new higher capacity low NOx burners, Class 1 igniters and scanners that are required. And finally, it makes sense that we would need to update our logic or our control system to be able to control and move from 100% natural gas to various coal-fired inputs. So a few technical details on supercritical boiler modifications required for dual fuel capability. Our current plan, again, is to modify the boiler to fire up to 40% natural gas. We're still working on some design details and capabilities to get to 100% dual fuel. But what we know so far is that we do need to install additional ducting to divert primary air to forced draft air system. We know we'll need additional piping to connect to the newer higher capacity natural gas pipeline, and minor changes to piping, electrical control systems, and some other infrastructure will be required.
So this is our last slide, and focuses on our the longer term interest and focus on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So just by way of brief background, before Capital Power was created through the IPO in 2009, when we were part of EPCOR Utilities, we actually did, around the 2005 timeframe, do a lot of work on carbon capture and storage and looking at integrated gasification combined cycle units at Genesee. And as part of the work at that time, we did lead a study with a FEED study co-funded with the province and the federal government about the technical viability and feasibility of IGCC at Genesee. So this is a space that we have history and have long been interested in. But so more recently, what's evolved is the growing interest in carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is as people will know, is the capture of carbon, but rather than storage or sequestration underground, it's converting the captured carbon into a wide range of usable products. And CCUS, there's a lot of activity going on globally, and the IPCC reports and most other longer-term scenarios do recognize CCUS as being an essential part of the toolkit for achieving the Paris commitments, along with the full suite of renewable and other technologies. And the potential promise of CCUS is, enabling zero or near zero emissions from gas generation, which is our immediate space. But more critically, it's the ability of the technology to capture carbon from industrial processes, petrochemical facilities, and that part of the economy, and moving the needle on that front. And so that's the promise there. But there's also the value available through the recovered carbon in the end markets. That does change the economic considerations in terms of the economic viability in our space. And there's also new industries that will emerge. So it is a very exciting field. That's a lot of work going on internationally. And here in Alberta, there's a lot underway as well, and that is largely focused around the Alberta Carbon Conversion Technology Centre, or the ACCTC. And this is a facility that was constructed with support from the governments of Alberta and Canada, and it's actually located adjacent to the Shepherd Energy Centre, which is an 800-megawatt combined cycle unit that we co-own with ENMAX, and ENMAX operates in Calgary. And what the facility is currently being used for is it's the host site for the natural gas track of the NRG COSIA Carbon X Prize competition. And there's 5 companies that are in the final stage of that competition, and I think the winners will be awarded next year sometime. There's a separate coal track underway, I understand, in the United States, but the Shepherd Center and the ACCTC is the home site for the natural gas track, and that facility, in our view, is something that's very exciting for Alberta. But so that's just set the stage for that, and then I'll turn it over to Lori to talk about C2CNT and our specific investment and interest there.
So C2CNT, which stands for carbon to carbon nanotubes, is a company that has developed a technology, a very innovative technology that captures and transforms carbon dioxide into a valuable product, or in this case, carbon nanotubes. So you can see from the graphic on the slide deck that this technology can capture CO2 from the air or from a stack, in our case from power generation stack, where you have a higher concentration of CO2. The electrolysis process using a lithium carbonate using a lithium carbonate electrolysis material, when power is applied, will separate and gather oxygen, pure oxygen, on one electrode, and dry powder carbon on the other electrode. And that carbon is what we're referring to as carbon nanotubes, which has a number of very useful components or capabilities in industry, anything from airplanes to wind turbines to materials. So that's sort of a bit about the process. The C2CNT technology has been tested and proven at a lab scale, and with the X Prize finalists, what the technology is being proven to be at a scale-up or pilot size, and then there are plans to grow that technology to a commercial size or a commercial scale. So the C2CNT is one of the finalists in the Gas Stream X Prize. So that's fairly exciting for the folks involved with C2CNT, and also for Capital Power, as we have an equity interest and also are providing power engineering and construction expertise to C2CNT.
So Jessica, that concludes our presentation.
Okay.
So again, thanks everyone on the call.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, Lori. That was a really interesting presentation. I mean, Capital Power is doing a lot to sort of lead in sustainability strategy, reduce emissions, improve efficiency of your coal-fired generation, and make investments in CCUS. And so I thought it was a really great presentation, very comprehensive, so thank you very much. And so now we have a few questions that have come in for Q&A. And so to kick things off, the first one is related to your last slide. And from your perspective, what do you think is needed to accelerate the deployment of CCUS?
So I think, as Lori touched on, I think it's just more projects advancing into that larger scale deployment and demonstration phase. So the next phase beyond the X Prize, but not specifically tied to the X Prize event. And in that regard, I would also add that recently C2CNT did receive some additional funding from the federal government to support development, its next level of development. And I understand last week in the U.S., the Department of Energy announced a round of funding to enable next generation CCUS projects moving ahead. So I think that's the first step. But kind of in parallel with that, as the technology does move out of the lab and out of the pilot stage, governments and regulators starting to develop the policy and legislative framework around it, whether it relates to permitting or how the emissions reductions achieved either at the host site or the end product get the treatment under carbon offset protocols and those types of things. So I think as the industry grows, there just needs to beyond, funding support by the government, starting to put the enabling policy framework around it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Second question that has come in is sort of more broad, but we have a lot of members who are, thinking about their strategies to have cleaner generation and to reduce their emissions. And so this question is, as other companies look to transition their generation fleets and reduce emissions, what 1 to 2 recommendations would you guys make to them from Capital Power's experiences, looking back on sort of your strategic planning and your investments in certain technologies?
So, and I can speak to that from a technology and an innovation perspective potentially. I don't know if I'd call it advice, but think that the fact that we've been very committed to asset maintenance and optimization for commercial imperative has helped foster a culture of innovation in a broader sense and across a range of operating, trading, technology, and commercial strategies. I think there's a fair bit of cultural influence that we have for innovation internally, as well as understanding that change takes time, change management is key, and sort of there's no real one big silver bullet in our experience. The common theme amongst the technologies we've deployed is it can be quite iterative, and sticking with it and seeing the small gains over time that fit into that larger or longer-term strategy is really the key.
Okay, thanks, Lori. And sort of looking at innovation, I know this question that has come in was going back to one of the slides you guys had that looks at the role you guys have for making some of your generation units hydrogen ready. And hydrogen has really been a rising topic as a future generation fuel. So this question is sort of your perspective on the future of hydrogen and sort of, what you guys are planning for that.
Well, Daniel did touch on that and part of our strategy, and I think what we've been working with a lot of our OEMs, and many of them are currently able to combust about 30-odd% of hydrogen with their existing combustion turbines. So we see alternative fuels, both hydrogen, oxy-fuel, as having the potential to become more mainstream in power generation. It kind of makes sense. You're eliminating carbon right out of the front end, so you're kind of at that advantage. But especially where byproducts and off-takers in other industries are in relatively close proximity, so that the business case is strong enough to support sort of your increased cost of on the fuel side for other fuel types like hydrogen or oxygen. Right.
Okay. Thank you. Well, that's all the questions that we have for you, Lori and Daniel. Thank you very much for this presentation. Very insightful. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to share the presentation slides with everyone who's on the line right now within about a week. And then we will have a recording of the webinar available on our YouTube channel as well. And if anyone wants to sort of continue the conversation or has any further questions, please feel free to email me at international@eei.org. And, we can make sure that we can put you in touch with Daniel and Lori and continue the discussion. So, Lori, Daniel, thank you very much. We really appreciate the time that you guys took to give this presentation today and look forward to continue to working with you.